former candidate for the U.S. Senate, longtime radio talk show host, author, and conservative policy advocate.
Justices to the Supreme Court, the left has been in open panic.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
President Trump and Republicans unleash a blistering attack on Joe Biden and the Democrats. So, what difference will it make? Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. The Republican Party, now fully the party of Donald Trump, unveils everyday heroes, inspirational stories of triumph through despair, a full-throated defense of the American way of life, a vigorous defense of Trump's record, and no-holds-barred attacks on Biden and the Democrats at their national convention. We'll analyze what they said and how it is likely to affect the campaign that gets underway in earnest right about now. We'll examine the question of which candidate represents the greater risk to the American people. And LibertyNation.com Editor-in-Chief Leesa K jumps on board to drill down on presidential polls famously wrong 4 years ago and the matter of whether we can trust them this time. So the Democrats and Republicans have now completed their primetime hours on stage, and the presidential campaign is off and running with just 2 months before Americans go to the polls. Which party gained and which lost at the end of this 2-week stretch of conventions, or was it a push? Joining us to consider the state of the race as we head up to Labor Day is our old friend, LibertyNation.com political columnist Joe Schaeffer, who has provided superb coverage of every night of both conventions. Welcome back, Joe.
Oh, thank you, Tim. It's good to be here.
Well, good to have you as always. So, Joe, did Republicans move the needle this week? And if so, was it more based on Trump's defense of his own record or his and his party's portrayal of Biden and the Democrats as truly dangerous to the safety and security of Americans?
You know what I think a lot of it was Trump's supporters were just waiting for a party. And it was too bad in that regard that it was virtual, because if it was live, like normal, I think it would have been really rollicking. We have a controlled media in this country. They've been pushing this narrative that the Democrats are on the cusp of some forward progress revolution. And we've all had to swallow it for so long in the midst of this pandemic. I think the grassroots people who supported Trump, they couldn't wait to have a moment where we can say, let's talk about Donald Trump. Let's boost him up. So I think that happened this week, and I think it's going to give him a significant boost. And, Joe Biden, you and I have both said we never believed that these polls saying he was in the lead were true. It'll be interesting to see how he holds on, given that I think Trump is going to have a surge.
So after not saying a single word about the riots overwhelming more than 24 cities at their own convention, Democrats finally permitted Biden to go out this week to decry the burning down of Kenosha, Wisconsin. Was this a course correction that will save Biden from his previous silence about this insurrection? Or is it too little too late to reverse the image of a candidate and party which has done and said almost nothing about some of our greatest cities being overrun by criminals?
Yeah, and he didn't even do a good job answering the question. He sounded weak. It sounded like he was at one of the primary debates where they were also just subservient to the progressive left. He actually said it's right-wingers and white supremacists causing this violence. Anybody who is paying the least bit of attention knows that that's not true. But he says it anyway because I think, he is being pressured by this progressive left. And he just comes out and says this stuff. It makes him look weak. He doesn't seem to realize it. If he had made some kind of, it didn't even have to be too forceful, just some kind of lip service to law and order. And yes, we do respect the police. It would have gone so much further, but he couldn't help injecting the identity politics, it's the right wingers doing this. It's not going to help him at all.
Well, now you said the expression respect the police. Now, it's one thing to decry open insurrection, the burning down, looting, rioting, the lives ruined, the people murdered, more than 30 of them now in this urban violence. But it's another thing to go beyond that as a Democrat and say, we support the police. Do you think Joe Biden will ever be compelled to say that? Is there any circumstance in which he must?
I don't think so, based on the fact that his self-appointed running mate was on, what was she on, the Colbert Show, and she promised people that these protests aren't going to stop. They're going to continue. They're going to make all of us uncomfortable. It almost sounded, I know she didn't quite mean it that way, but it almost sounded like she was threatening every American citizen in this country. This is how off they are. This is how off the reservation. They're not in control of their own narrative. They're undisciplined. It's crazy how much the progressive left is running this show. And we have to ask, why did you pick Joe Biden then if you were going to do this anyway? He's not, I know you said, the Trojan horse, the smiling guy who's going to get them in. He's not going to be an effective communicator of this message for the next 2 months. And, this thing can really, really go downhill fast for the Democrats. And that was always the risk when you chose Joe Biden to be your nominee.
I think about how quickly Jimmy Carter sunk in 1980 against Ronald Reagan in a race that was very tight until the single debate. And then when Carter went out there, he looked overmatched against Reagan, and Reagan wound up winning a 45-state landslide. And Dukakis in 1988, who came out of his convention with a 17-point lead and lost by 8 points. So that's a 25-point turnaround in a couple of months, maybe 3. So what you're saying is you think that there could be a real nosedive, a plunge for Biden.
And what I find most interesting, maybe the most interesting thing of this whole Republican convention is I get the feeling that they were counting on it. That this was a very confident convention. I wrote some critical things and I stand by them, but they were. I was expecting more red meat, more hitting, more action. It was a very hey, we've got this record. We're the incumbents. We're in the White House. Come get us. And this kind of feeling that Joe Biden can't do it. So Joe Biden is ostensibly way up in the polls. And it was a very, very confident Donald Trump last night giving his speech. And it sounded like a State of the Union address. And he was just ticking off the accomplishments and saying, this is what I'm doing. This is what I'm doing. It was the aura of a man who believes that he is going to win. I don't think he's too worried about Joe Biden. And I thought that is a great selling point for Trump, that he came across that way.
Yeah, I think in 2016, he sort of forced his optimism to some degree because he had such a huge hill to climb. I agree that it seems like this time he's got a real inner confidence, having been in the job for 4 years, knowing what it's about, and importantly, Joe, finding out through a long process who he can trust, who he can't in assembling a second-term administration. But there's no question that this election to a large degree, will pivot on the perception of the person of President Trump because no one's excited about Joe Biden. How do you think the perception of Trump, the person, changed, if at all, after 4 days of this convention?
Well, I think it's interesting that he is clearly running as an incumbent. He's not running as an insurgent. He's not that bomb thrower from 2016. He's grown into the job. He's acting very presidential. The Democrats are making a good strategy by being so crazy and chaotic and endorsing violence in the streets. Donald Trump was considered this maniac in 2016 by the media. Donald Trump is the adult in the room now. They've actually done that. The idea was Joe Biden was to return to normalcy. And now Democrats are rioting in the streets. They're making Donald Trump, the guy they want to present as this lunatic. They're making him normalcy to people who aren't devoted to Donald Trump. They're going to see that and they're going to say, yeah, we know who the insane ones are, and it's not the president.
So Joe Biden is putting almost all his eggs in the anti-Trump basket, hoping people will blame Trump for the pandemic and the violence in the streets. But Trump, in turn, has so many possible lines of attack on Biden, as he showed in his acceptance speech, which put Biden on a spit and roasted every inch of him. What aspects would you expect the Trump campaign to particularly focus on or emphasize in the remaining 8 weeks of this campaign?
Well, I thought there were two in particular. I thought 47 years is never going to grow old. They can keep throwing that out there for the next 2 months, and it is always going to work. This man was in the seat, in the room of political power, of elite political power for 47 years. He goes back to Richard Nixon's first term, right? So that he got in there before Watergate. He's been in there that long, hasn't really accomplished a lot, and he is actually running, like you said, an anti-Trump campaign. Nearly 50 years in politics, and he's not bringing any ideas of his own to the table. He's running against something else.
Well, Joe, as always, we appreciate your wit and wisdom, and I know we'll be getting together again a whole lot sooner than later as we approach the crux, the heart of the 2020 presidential campaign. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Joe Schaeffer, LibertyNation.com. Quick break, and then we're back with the editor-in-chief of LibertyNation.com to discuss those pesky presidential polls.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Polls, polls, polls. Get ready to be overwhelmed with metrics regarding the election, now just over 2 months away. But after all the major polls, except one, completely blew it in 2016, with near universal predictions of a Hillary Clinton victory and an easy win to boot, just how much can we really rely on these same polls this time around? Joining us to dig into the efficacy, the meaning or lack thereof of the polls being released day after day is the editor-in-chief of LibertyNation.com, recent and future sponsor of the only poll which got it right 4 years ago, Rasmussen, who doubles as our resident polling geek and also as my better half, Leesa K. Donner. Hello, Leesa.
Hi, Tim. Well, you know I'm not a big numbers fan, but I must admit I love the crosstabs in the polls.
It's true, and we're going to talk about them, but I want to start by playing a statement the morning after the 2016 election by John Heilman, one of the most respected inside the Beltway political analysts.
Polling is broken, like in a profound, deep way, and the Clinton campaign was really genuinely convinced, I mean, up until 8:30 last night, that they were totally fine in Pennsylvania, they were going to win Michigan, they were going to win Wisconsin, they were going to be fine in Colorado, that they had the whole thing in hand, and genuinely confident about that. Their numbers were as messed up as the public polling is.
So, Leesa, what, if anything, have these polling firms that got it all wrong last time actually done to make us believe them this time around?
Well, I don't think much, and that is, therein lies the problem. There's a difference between push polling and reality polling. What I tend to get from Rasmussen as I look at their samples, their sample size, their methodology, their crosstabs, who they're sampling, how many they're sampling, of what demographic, I tend to get a sense of reality. When I dig into the CNN polls, even the Fox polls, what I find is a lot more in terms of push polling. They're oversampling the Democrats. They're undersampling the Republicans. And I really don't know why.
So Liberty Nation's been sponsoring the Rasmussen poll during the two conventions and will do so again in the final run-up to the election. And you're doing this because as editor-in-chief, you're convinced Rasmussen is the most reliable poll. Now, what did Rasmussen specifically do right in 2016 that all the others did wrong?
Well, let me just say this. We are sponsoring the Presidential Daily Tracking Poll by Rasmussen. I think what Rasmussen does is they look at the electorate and they tend to mirror their samples demographically by the electorate. So if X amount of Democrats voted in 2016, they're going to sample X amount of Democrats, of X amount of blacks and whites and women and Latinos. and on and on. They try to mirror their sample from everything I can see. I don't see that as much in other polls. It asks a simple, direct question.
Now, you've just written a piece on LibertyNation.com called "The Chicks Are Stealing the Show," all about the strong, independent women who were showcased by the GOP at their convention from First Lady Melania Trump on down, with those pesky suburban white women who are offended by Trump's coarseness, seeming to draw a lot of attention. What kind of shape is Trump in with women voters?
Well, I wrote on LibertyNation.com before the Republican National Convention that Trump really had some work to do with women. The Republican National Committee has really heard that. Ronna McDaniel has taken that to heart. And she's, I think, made an extra effort to put up strong, powerful, inspiring women. Some of them may be well known. Some of them you've never heard of before. But my gosh, when a woman stands there and says, President Trump helped me survive from bone cancer, or President Trump helped me keep my dairy farm, and they do it in a very convincing, personal way, I think that really speaks to women voters.
Now, people who study polls often talk about the so-called crosstabs, which break the numbers down into smaller subsets like black and white voters, male and female, young and old, etc. Which of these crosstabs do you find most revealing or surprising so far about the 2020 election?
Well, the one for me that had a red alert for Donald Trump was the gender gap. Biden kept consistently polling better on the Rasmussen polls with women. They're not going to get black women, but they can get more black men. And I think there's a lot of chatter about that. And they can't get more white women. Women's issues are generally security, education. These are the things that they vote on.
Very simple, straight to the point, just the way you are with me. Leesa, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Tim.
Leesa K. Donner, Editor-in-Chief of LibertyNation.com. Quick break, and then we're back with our signature segment, Say What?
Ready, set, go!
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com, because we put the power of the press in your hands. With one click, Liberty Nation delivers tomorrow's news.
And remember, liberty.
Today.
All the time and everywhere.
Liberty Nation connected the dots between a Chinese research biolab and a wet market where COVID-19 was supposedly discovered 2 months before the MSM. We were first to alert you of a serious attack on gun rights in Virginia. LN honed in on the Biden-Burisma scandal months before it hit the papers. We brought you exclusive interviews from the border.
We're looking at people just rising up.
Liberty Nation was on the ground in London.
Trump rally in front of the American embassy.
Bringing you on-the-scene reports about Brexit. LN reported that COVID-19 was more virulent but less deadly weeks before others. LibertyNation.com delivers tomorrow's news today with LNTV's Liberty Nation Radio, the Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and dozens of insightful original articles, and a new Roku channel. Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. LibertyNation.com.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
And now it is time for our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. The Republicans responded to the doom and gloom and deeply personal attacks on the president by the Democrats at their convention last week with a soaring defense of traditional American values, defending the nation, as they loudly decried the breakdown of civility and the culture itself amidst the rioting, looting, burning, the insurrections in cities across the land, which is now expanding and threatening more and more safe suburban communities. The Republican Party is offering a full-throated defense of the America we've known, while Democrats promise a different country, the completion of what Barack Obama promised and began, the fundamental transformation of America. But for all the talk of Republican virtue and Democratic intransigence, the president made one proclamation during his acceptance speech which would likely guarantee him victory if his promise is kept.
We have 3 different vaccines in the final stage of trials. Right now, years ahead of what has been achieved before. Nobody thought it could ever be done this fast. Normally it would be years, and we did it in a matter of a few months. We're producing them in advance so that hundreds of millions of doses will be quickly available. We will have a safe and effective vaccine this year, and together we will crush the virus.
Trump later said we might have a vaccine before the end of the year. Translation, he'll try and make the COVID vaccine his huge October surprise, leading right up to the election. But when it came to making the case for law and order, as opposed to lawlessness and chaos on the left, the GOP rolled out a number of law enforcement officials and then the former mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, to issue a stark warning.
New York City, once described as America's crime capital, had become, by the mid-1990s, America's safest large city. Now today, my city is in shock. Murders, shootings, and violent crime are increasing at percentages unheard of in the past. We're seeing the return of rioting and looting. During riots, this Democrat mayor, like others, has often prevented the police from making arrests. And even when arrests are made, liberal, progressive DAs release the rioters so as not to disrupt the rioting. Don't let Democrats do to America what they have done to New York.
But the Republicans did not limit their rhetoric to their opponent. The GOP understandably chose to list the many accomplishments of President Donald Trump, believing his record in 3.5 years contrasted with Biden's record over 47 years in Washington is a winning strategy. The president's son, Eric Trump, laid out the record with about the most concise summary of what you'll be hearing over and over from the Trump campaign in the next 2 months.
Taxes were slashed, regulations were cut, and the economy soared to new heights. Wages went through the roof. Unemployment reached historic lows, especially for Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, and women. Lights were turned back on in abandoned factories across our country. Trillions of dollars were repatriated back to the United States, which had been sitting in foreign lands for far too long. Over and over, issue after issue, the economy, the wall, the military, trade deals, tax cuts, Supreme Court justices, VA hospitals, prescription drugs, school choice, right to try, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, peace in the Middle East. Never-ending wars were finally ended. Promises made and promises for the first time were kept.
A real track record, but Trump's record is not what the Democrats have been attacking. It's his character. He's a racist, even a white supremacist, say the socialists on the left. So the Republican Party sent out one of their rising black stars, Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron, to discuss his own rise from humble roots and decry the stereotypes perpetuated by Joe Biden.
I think often about my ancestors who struggled for freedom. And as I think of those giants and their broad shoulders, I also think about Joe Biden, who says, if you aren't voting for me, you ain't black, who argued that Republicans would put us back in chains, who says there is no diversity of thought in the black community. Mr. Vice President, look at me. I am black. We are not all the same, sir. I am not in chains. My mind is my own, and you can't tell me how to vote because of the color of my skin.
Powerful stuff. What do you know, Mr. Former Vice President? Black people can actually think for themselves, which can only be bad news for the Democratic nominee, because one way or another, mark my words, there will be a reckoning among the black people of this country, which could be the biggest story of the election. While Democrats focused almost exclusively on the character of Donald Trump in their convention, there were so many lines of attack on Joe Biden at the GOP convention that you could hardly keep track. But here's one that was gaining steam before the COVID hit, and which you'll also be hearing much about in the weeks ahead. And the messenger was Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi.
We all know about Joe's son, Hunter Biden. A corrupt Ukrainian oligarch put Hunter on the board of his gas company, even though he had no experience in Ukraine or in the energy sector. None. Yet he was paid millions to do nothing. He only had one qualification that mattered. He was the son of the man in charge of distributing U.S. aid to Ukraine. Now let's talk about China. Fact. Joe Biden flew to China on Air Force Two with Hunter along for the ride. 10 days later, those Chinese communist bankers approved millions to go to Hunter's firm.
Now, that's a twofer for the Republicans, cashing in on the public trust as vice president and doing it not just in Ukraine, but in China, probably the most hated nation in the world among Americans. Meanwhile, when Democrats were holding their convention, Trump was out making public appearances in battleground states. But with the GOP convention on, Joe Biden had nothing on his calendar, confirming the notion that he's no longer, shall we say, up to campaigning around the clock the way you need to ordinarily in a presidential campaign, and that his strategy, at least for now, continues to be the basement strategy. Rope-a-dope. Sit back, take a pounding, and then just, well, sit back again. But Biden did submit to an interview on ABC News in which he made a most revealing statement about COVID-19.
I would be prepared to do whatever it takes to save lives, because we cannot get the country moving until we control the virus. That is the fundamental flaw of this administration's thinking to begin with. In order to keep the country running and moving and the economy growing and people employed, you have to fix the virus. You have to deal with the virus.
So if the scientists say, shut it down?
I would shut it down. I would listen to the scientists.
Now, that is the opposite of President Trump, who says he will never shut down the country again during this pandemic, but would deal with regional outbreaks and provide special protections for the sickest and oldest among us. God knows what will happen to this country if a President Biden orders another national shutdown. But the most powerful Democrat in the nation, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, is busy whipping her base into a frenzy over Trump allegedly trying to suppress the vote.
We take an oath to protect and defend the Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic. And sadly, the domestic enemies to our voting system and our honoring our Constitution are right at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. They're doing everything they can, suppress the vote with your actions, scare people, intimidate by saying law enforcement will be there, diminish the role of the postal system in all of this. It's really actually shameful. Enemies of the state.
Enemies of the state. You can't make a more serious accusation than that. But you can see where they're headed with this. They're setting up to dispute a Trump victory no matter what. And the loser from 2016 did not mince words in Hillary's usually incredibly grating voice when she issued instructions to this year's nominee.
We have to have our own teams of people to counter the force of intimidation that the Republicans and Trump are going to put outside polling places. Joe Biden should not concede under any circumstances, because I think this is going to drag out, and eventually I do believe he will win if we don't give an inch.
That is a remarkable statement. Joe Biden should not concede under any circumstances. Like, if they just keep trying to find votes after Election Day, they'll eventually win. Or maybe they can prove the Russians stole the election, just like in 2016. And Trump just keeps driving leftists crazy by making this kind of statement right after being officially nominated by his party for a second term.
4 more years! 4 more years!
Now, if you want to really drive him crazy, you say 12 more years.
Trump is a dictator. Trump will shred the Constitution, plans to be president for life. He just keeps baiting his enemies, and they respond every time like Pavlov's dogs. Quick break, and then we'll return to consider the question of which candidate represents the greater risk for the average voter, Donald Trump or Joe Biden.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
No matter who you voted for in 2016, it was clear which presidential candidate represented the greater risk for the average voter. Whether you liked Hillary Clinton or not, she was undeniably the safer choice based on her experience in the White House and Senate and as Secretary of State. You knew almost exactly what you'd be getting with the first female president in American history. Donald Trump? Not so much. Okay, that's an understatement. A big one. Sure, he had all manner of huge, uniquely ambitious plans to overturn the political establishment and permanent bureaucracy that's been increasingly reviled by the American people. He delivered an unbroken string of explosively controversial statements, any one of which would have ended the career of a typical politician. He'd never even run for office before and was trying to become the leader of the free world, for heaven's sake. We had no idea if he could really pull off his swamp-draining agenda or how hard he'd really try. There was much talk of the Trump candidacy being little more than a publicity stunt, that he was seeking a job he would never get, and even if he somehow did, he'd lose interest in it after a while. Fast forward to 2020, and who represents the bigger risk this time around? The great irony is that the man who has impaled the entrenched, encrusted establishment may well be viewed as the safer choice, while his opponent, who represents a return to D.C.-style normalcy, may for good reason be viewed as the greater risk. Since Trump turned things on their head starting 4 years ago, we all know what we can expect from him in a second term. A continuing agenda of job growth, economic expansion, deregulation, the border wall, constitutionally based judges, and yes, law and order. In stark contrast, Joe Biden made clear in the words of his acceptance speech at the DNC convention and as demonstrated throughout his lengthy political career, that he's actually at odds with his own party right now. He called for a return to decency as Democrat mayors across the nation allow spectacularly indecent behavior to continue almost unabated. He called for unity when his progressive base wants none of it. The dialogue is over. He declared that he would be an American president for all the people, while his party is increasingly overrun by those who judge solely on the basis of skin color and seek to dismantle the entire structure of what they call a systemically racist nation. Biden spoke of light and love as his party unleashed a torrent of darkness and hate on the person of Trump. All this as Biden and his party sit silent while gangs of savages burn down cities with little resistance from ruling Democrats, and they're now expanding their reign of terror from riot-torn cities to the peaceful suburbs. Given the dualism of today's Democratic Party, a historically moderate candidate fronting a party increasingly enthralled to the hard left. Do we really have any idea what the former vice president would do if he takes a seat in the Oval Office? What could Biden, a lifelong legislator, do to try to combat COVID-19 other than a national mask mandate that Trump, the CEO president, hasn't done or tried already? Biden claims he would be tough on China, but has been an apologist for the Chinese throughout most of his 47-year career. He obviously plans to raise taxes, but how much once he feels the heat from his left? And yes, given his limited capacity, as demonstrated by a white calendar week while Trump and the GOP present a soaring pro-American convention, what are the chances Biden could even make it through a full 4 years? Will people really be voting for Biden for president or Kamala Harris? Biden promises a return to normalcy when normal on the left has become the insurrection in our streets we've been forced to witness despite an elite media blackout for, these many weeks or months. To what version of normal would we be returning? The days of Obama? Not likely, as the Democrats have obviously moved on from the first black president, finding him insufficiently radical for the times. And Obama, in turn, has seemed to show little interest in assuming an active role in the party. One of the things we'll certainly find out is whether Donald Trump was elected president only because Hillary Clinton was such a poor candidate, as many Democrats privately believe. And one look at their radical 2020 agenda provides not a hint of belief in Democrat ranks that they were rejected on substance 4 years ago. Biden is essentially calling for America to go back to the future, to return to the halcyon days when he and Obama ruled the land. But he's trying to sell a return to civility while civil unrest, tolerated if not embraced by his own party, courses through the land like a pandemic of its own. The sweep of history demonstrates that Americans are not terribly risk-averse when it comes to untested candidates seeking the highest office in the land. Skeptics declared that John F. Kennedy couldn't win because he was Catholic, Obama because he was black, Clinton because he was tarred as a womanizer and draft dodger, Reagan because he was depicted as a dangerous warmonger. They were all elected and re-elected, if you count LBJ's election in 1964 as a replacement for the martyred John F. Kennedy. The big difference this year is that the candidate who's been in plain sight for almost half a century in Washington and served as a senator and vice president might well represent a far greater risk in this most improbable year than the candidate who just 4 years ago was the very definition of the word risky. This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott Cosenza, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose with our own Mark Angelides, all available on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. And don't forget the new LibertyNation.com Roku channel. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week, same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying, stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.